it's been around for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we were in. But when you asked, the question was about myths. And the reason I wanted to start with Baki and just explaining that is because the Supreme Court said something else that's really important. Now, notice I said Baki was decided in 1978, 79. It's like 45 years ago. And they said the one thing that schools can't do, they can't have a quota. So, for instance, Harvard University can't say, okay, we're going to admit 500 people to our Kennedy School of Government this year. We're going to set aside 100 seats for Black people, 500 for Latinos, you know, 550 for, Asians. You can't do that. And the reason I'm talking about that as a myth is the way people talk about affirmative action still today. You would think that quotas were the law of the land and that every university used a quota system. Universities have not used quotas since the 1970s. Why? Because the Supreme Court said that they can't. And that's really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to mention that because I think that the only way I think we get forward is to combat misinformation. And a lot of folks, including some of us, probably thought that that was the case. And I just want everyone to know that's not true.
Mm-hmm. So Baki complained he couldn't get into the school. Did he ever get into medical school, or did he end up just going another route?
You
I
know,
wonder.
I think I think he did, but don't quote me on that because
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I I don't want to be too flippant about this, but when it comes to people like that, I don't invest a lot of time in them because ever since we were able to get a foothold and have some sort of rights, people have been trying to find ways to undermine us. Instance, you in 1954, our K through 12 schools, the Supreme Court ordered them to be integrated. So, what was the first thing that happened? They fought. If you ever saw any footage of the Little Rock Nine going into that high school, and you see all of these grown adults, screaming and spitting at these Black children, because that's what they were, because they were just teenagers. And that was one thing that they did. In some places, I know that you're in this area of the country, in Prince William County, Virginia, they actually shut down all of the public high schools rather than integrate them. And that was
Whoa.
another response. Yeah, just ridiculous. So after in the 60s and 70s, after the Warren Court started, giving us more rights and doing things like that, then the backlash happened. And when the backlash happened, what you saw was attorneys on the right making a concerted effort to kind of roll back these gains that we hadn't made. So the affirmative action decision was the product of, I would say, at least 40 years worth of work on behalf of a lot of white folks who wanted this to happen. And I say white folks, but there's some of us who are invested in this too, unfortunately, trying to make this happen because they just don't want to acknowledge the history. So a big part of how we got here, it was not accident. There was a literal movement trying to make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
And because of Trump's election and his ability to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, they got what they wanted.
Gee. Who benefits the most? You would think that certain people will benefit, but who does benefit the most from affirmative action?
Well, see, I think you have to look at that question in two ways.
Mm-hmm.
Before I came on today, I looked up, and um, Black folks, you will often hear people say that white women have been the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. And there is some truth to that, whether you look at affirmative action in the workplace or whether you look at it in higher ed. If you look at the numbers. So, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, there was a study that showed, like, but this is back from the 90s. The article was from this year, but the only data they had was back from the 90s, where it said, well, there was an increase of 6 million uh, white female students compared to like 5 million students of color, like together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the numbers. However, I also want to say that I think we can't underestimate the ability of policies to change what people think of as possible, if that makes sense. So I think one of the psychological things about affirmative action is us knowing that if we're qualified, we deserve a spot. And I am someone who is a graduate, a proud graduate of not one, but two HBCUs. I like HBCUs so much, I doubled down the second time. I do believe that HBCUs are some of America's finest educational institutions. Uh, However, in the early years of HBCUs, we were going to HBCUs because we had no choice. I chose to go to a HBCU. I had other options,
Mm-hmm.
both times for undergrad and grad school. But our ancestors, in the 1800s and 19 teens, 1920s, et cetera, they went to HBCUs because the white colleges weren't letting them in.
Mm-hmm.
So then once affirmative action comes in, it's sort of like, okay, well, I know that if I put in my application and I have the grades and I have the test scores, they got to at least give me a shot. So, saying that to say, not that we need validation from white folks, but it's almost like if you walk into a room and you see a bunch of people wearing red Make America Great Again hats, you're going to kind of be like, mm, I don't know if I'm going to be welcome in this room. I might turn around and go back and leave this room. But if the room is more neutral, you might feel like you might be welcomed. You might feel more comfortable exploring the room. And if people are actively doing things, if they have, some Black Lives Matter apparel, something like that, you might actually feel welcomed in that room, even though people don't look like you. So, what I'm saying all of that to say is, I think one of the biggest things that we can't discount about affirmative action is the psychological impact. And I actually do have at least one data point for that because in California, when they killed affirmative action because they had a statewide vote, California has these weird procedures called referendum, initiative, and recall.
Mm-hmm.
They can recall the governor if they get X amount of signatures, and they can start a ballot initiative if they get enough signatures. So some folks got really excited in California to end affirmative action. California is one of the most progressive states in the country, but they got a good core of Republicans there too, and those were the folks who got it on the ballot. And I guess I don't know if enough people turned out, showed up, or didn't understand the issues, but it passed. So, because that passed, it really affected the makeup of a lot of the schools in California. For instance, Berkeley Law School, which is one of the larger law schools in America, the fall after that passed, they had one Black student. And so, because a lot of people, they saw what California, what their schools were doing, like, I'm not going to put up with that. So I just want to put out there that we can't discount the idea that having some kind of affirmative action policy makes us feel more comfortable about applying to different places.